Welcome everybody to our February JETI talk. I just want to point out that our March talk will not be at the beginning of March. It will be at the end of March, the last Tuesday in March, in time for Passover. Hinda Kimmel and Ruth Radin are going to talk about flourless and fantastic desserts for Passover. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Robert Levin. He was born and raised and educated in Providence, Rhode Island. He's a magna cum laude graduate of Brown University and its medical school. He did his postgraduate time in Philadelphia and Farmington, Connecticut, and he settled into a solo rheumatology practice in New London County, Connecticut. He's the chief emeritus of rheumatology at Lawrence Memorial Hospital in New London. He does volunteer practice in the Indigent Rheumatology Clinic in Lake Worth, Florida, and teaches at FAU Medical School. He works part-time as a scientific review officer for General Dynamics Information Technology. He's happily married to his beautiful and multi-talented wife of 46 years, Mona, and has 3 sons and 5 grandchildren. His grandfather was his introduction to the history of the early Zionist movement, and in particular, the formation of the first Jewish armed force since the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans. His grandfather was a soldier in the Gedud, otherwise known as the Jewish Legion. Robert, it's all yours.
Thank you. Momentous in a sense that what I'm going to be talking about largely revolves around a time when Jews were stateless. There is nobody here, I think, who can remember a time when Israel didn't exist. Israel's going to be 75 years old this year. So I don't think there's literally anyone left who remembers what it was like for Jews before Israel existed. And how did this come about? Well, it came about in a number of ways. And my grandfather was a part of this, a small part of it, but a number of circumstances led to what happened. And in particular, a date which, let's see if I can get this to work here, that is momentous is Sunday, June 28th, 1914, because of 2 coinciding events that happened at literally the same hour. It changed the world and is still affecting the world to this day. On that date, around 6 in the morning, my grandfather boat came into port. He was coming from Russia with his family on the boat, the Dwinsk. It was a boat. It was a 12-day voyage with my my great-grandfather and my and his oldest son, my Uncle Louis, were already in Montreal to meet the family when they finally did arrive. So my great-grandmother came with 5 of her children, 2 boys and 3 girls, and my grandfather being the oldest of the children. This boat, the Dwinsk, was owned by the Russian-American Line. It was taken over by Cunard in 1917 and was sunk by U-151 on the 18th of June in 1918. So this didn't have very much longer to live after it went into British hands. This is the ship's log of the people who were on the boat, including down here in the corner, starts with Sophie Petrovitsky. That was my great-grandmother. And the 5 children who are listed were Fivish, Solomon, Ivonia, Sima, and Gitta. When their names were anglicized, it was Philip, Donald, Evelyn, Sally, and Gertie. So those were my uncles and aunts. And they all came together with my great-grandmother on that boat on that day. And this is where they ended up in Halifax. This is called the Shack, Pier 2. This was the main disembarkation point for 2.5 million immigrants to Canada from 1880 to 1925. This was their Ellis Island. And later on, this was all put into a museum at Pier 21, which I'll talk about a little later. This is my grandfather's inspection card when he came off the boat. This was through Canadian immigration. You can barely see, he did pass the medical examination because the medical stamp is there, you can barely see. But you can see that people were having typos even back in those days, because that's an inspection cadder instead of an inspection card. So somebody screwed up there. So they were from his name, Fivish Petrovitsky, from Rogachev, which was in Belarus. And the date was June 16th. Well, they disembarked on June 16th, 1914, and arrived on June 28th. And on the back of the card, instructions were at the bottom in Yiddish. So they had a variety of languages here for all the people who were coming into Canada through Halifax. Now, June 28th, 1914 is an auspicious date because at the same time, literally at the same hour that my grandfather arrived in Halifax, in Sarajevo, Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. That was at 11 o'clock in the morning, which coincides to 6 o'clock in the morning in Halifax. So the start of the First World War coincided with the beginnings of the First World War, and what led to it coincided with the day that my grandfather arrived in Canada. And this led, of course, to a number of things that obviously were bad, because the assassination led to war. Austria began the war 1 month to the day after the Archduke was assassinated along with his wife. Serbia would not accede to Austrian demands, which were quite stern. And basically Austria was pressured by Germany to basically attack Serbia. But this is the problem that happened, and this is the problem with alliances. There were alliances that united or divided Europe, the Triple Entente, the Central Powers, and there were neutral countries. But Serbia was aligned with Russia. And if Serbia was attacked, then Russia would come to its aid, forcing France and the United Kingdom to also join on the side of Russia. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey were part of the Central Powers, and they were allied as well. And this led to an inevitable domino effect, leading to the war and the beginnings of the war. So what were the problems for Jews in the late 1800s? They had been stateless for over 1700 years, endless anti-Semitism, more on the part of Christians and Muslims. European persecution had its own unique words that go with it: inquisition, blood libel, expulsions, pogroms, job discrimination, social discrimination. The Russian Pale was nothing more than enforced poverty. Western Europe had opportunity, but also assimilation. Eastern Europe was basically religious theocracy. And although every year at Yom Kippur and Passover, people were saying next year in Jerusalem, nothing happened, but religious Zionism started taking root in the 1860s. So these are the trends behind the emergence of Zionism in Europe: the Enlightenment and the emancipation of Western and Central Europe under Napoleon. So collective identities were dissolved in favor of individual rights as citizens. In the rest of Europe, state centralization and enlightened absolutism in Eastern Europe. So Jews could be fully modern and maintain ethnic identities and institutions as long as it was consistent with the broader national trends. Except in Russia, you could do that, but you could never become a citizen. So both of these would lead some Jews towards Zionism, although not always for the same reasons, since the political situation in Western and Central Europe was quite a bit different than Eastern Europe. In fact, the first nation to actually liberate their Jews, most people think was France. It was actually Austria. Go to the next slide. So this is really the beginnings of Zionism being spoken of. The idea that Jews could be fully realized culturally and politically only in a homeland of their own. This was the work of Leon Pinsker, who was a Russian Jewish physician who was living in Poland. And in the book was called Auto-Emancipation. In 1882 is an auspicious year with respect to the fate of Jews in Europe in the 19th century. In Russia, confidence and integration was stalled, and it was primarily because of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, who was actually one of the more enlightened of the czars, who had tried to include Jews more into the life of Russia. And with his death and the accession to the throne of his son, there was a rollback of the inclusive laws, and there was a huge outbreak of pogroms. So the first Aliyah, which I refer to as half-baked idealism, the Biluim, with the first Aliyah, they were influenced by Marx as well as the Bible. So you could call them basically godless Jews, in a sense. They had been forbidden to own land in Russia, and the country had almost no Jewish farmers. So they arrived in Palestine with a lot of goodwill, but little money and virtually no agricultural experience. So they found life particularly difficult. At about that time, two established Palestinian Jews set up a farm settlement of Rishon LeZion, which will have a place with respect to my grandfather later on. Rishon LeZion being first in Zion. But within a few months, the Biluim faced starvation, and most of them had to leave. So the first Aliyah was not particularly successful. Within Europe, though, things deteriorated even in Western Europe. Now, Jews had been emancipated in France for over 100 years, and yet we had the Dreyfus Affair, a sordid tale of lies, forgery, misjustice, treason, and cover-up after cover-up at the highest levels of the French military. And what one might have expected if the Jews were actually fully integrated into France was the crowds yelling death to the traitor. No, they yelled death to the Jew. And that had an effect, they say, on Theodor Herzl, who was reporting on this along with Max Nordau for the Vienna New Press. This is always felt to have been by myth that this was what drove Herzl towards Zionism. In actuality, it was the city elections in Vienna about a year later when the Christian socialists, normally a middle of the road party, was not getting much traction. So they decided that nationalism and anti-Semitism would get them more votes, and they swept the election in the city. However, to accede to mayor in Vienna was at the behest, had to be with the permission of the emperor, Franz Joseph. He wanted no part of that. He would not allow the Christian socialist mayor, well, the mayor-elect, to take the position for 2 years until it was past the time when he could intervene. So this is Theodor Herzl, and two of his famous works, the Judenstaat, the Jewish State, and Alte Neuland, the Old New Land. Now, he was a lot more assimilated than Max Nordau, whose father was a rabbi. Herzl basically concluded that no amount of assimilation would ever give Jews acceptance as full citizens in any European country. So he basically wrested the fledgling Zionist movement from a famous individual known as Ahad Ha'am, who was more a cultural Zionist than a political Zionist. So at this point, Zionism becomes more of a political entity. Now, come the beginnings of the First World War, the Yishuv, which was the Jewish community in Palestine, the goal was to turn the desert into a green land of milk and honey. And in 1914, at the start of the war, what was the Jewish community made of? Remnants of the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, which is about 40,000 Russian Jews who escaped the pogroms, Messianic pilgrims who dated back to the 1840s, and members of the Yemenite Aliyah, which was a huge Aliyah that took place in the 1800s at the behest of rabbis in Yemen. By 1914, Jerusalem had been a majority Jewish city for almost 50 years. So this was the makeup of the community, but Arabs far outnumbered the Jews at that point in time. The Ottoman Empire, in which Palestine was at one point huge, as you can see by at its height in 1683, fairly huge, encompassing North Africa, the Balkans, Turkey, even up to the Caucasus Mountains. But by 1914, that darker orange area, that was it. They had this was an empire that was a morass of corruption, and starting with Greek independence in 1829, things started to fall apart. In the 1870s, the loss of the Balkan states, then earlier on Egypt and Algeria and Tunisia. So this was a regime that was on the downside. And in the Balkans, of course, there was Muslim and Christian strife, which exists to this very day. So nothing there really changed. So with regards to Ottoman Turkey and the early Zionists, The Balkans, as I said, were lost by 1900. The government was deteriorating and corrupt. The Young Turk Revolution that took place in the early 1900s against the absolutist monarchy couldn't even keep themselves together. They split. The Zionist movement turned from political to settlement and nation building, and they tried to negotiate with the Turks for land in the province of Palestine. Now, interestingly, on the eve of the war, the German Zionist view was the prevailing view in the Zionist movement. Settle Palestine for the poor and persecuted Jews of the Pale, but not for the acculturated or assimilationist Western European Jews. So when the war began, the headquarters for the World Zionist Organization was actually in Berlin. Meanwhile, back in Montreal with my grandfather, they lived in the immigrant ghetto on Rue Cadeau in Plateau, Montreal. This was Montreal's first Jewish neighborhood. And interestingly, it is now the newest Jewish neighborhood in Montreal, as younger Jewish families are deciding not to live in Côte Saint-Luc and are moving back to Plateau. So it's becoming Jewish again. He sold the Montreal Gazette at the corner of Duluth and St. Dominic, which was actually within viewing distance of my son when he would go to the sports complex at McGill when he was a student there. He could actually see down the street to the exact street corner where his grandfather sold newspapers, his great-grandfather sold newspapers. He learned how to play hockey like the other kids did at Parc La Fontaine. Everyone had to do work because they were poor and there were a lot of mouths to feed. He was raised in a traditional Orthodox household, but they also faced anti-Semitism from the Québécois. And something that Lou Detz and I always shared, because he grew up in Laval, which is the next town north of Montreal, was hearing from the Québécois Mouji Juif, dirty Jew. We'd hear that frequently. So with the war declared, the World Zionist Organization declared neutrality, with Jews fighting on both sides, and moved its headquarters to a neutral state in Denmark. And with the start of the war, the Ottomans decided to crack down on the Jewish community in Palestine. They halted shipping of supplies to the settlers for like farming supplies and so forth, seeds, fertilizer, all those things. Then they expelled about half the Jewish community, about 18,000, including David Ben-Gurion, to Egypt because they feared a fifth column would develop there. They confiscated farm equipment and produce from the settlements, and those who were left behind had dealt with starvation and deprivation. A number of Jews died of starvation. In fact, the Turkish chief of the military government there decided that he would do a little different than murder. As the Turks murdered the Armenians, they decided to starve the Jews. And the Turks occupied the Sinai Peninsula at that point. So we see the rebirth of the Jewish soldier. These are three key figures in the rebirth of the existence of even Jewish soldiers, which had not existed in 1900 years. Trumpeldor, Joseph Trumpeldor in particular, was a true Zionist hero. He was the only Jewish officer in the Russian army. He lost his left arm in the Russo-Japanese War. He was second in command of the Zion Mule Corps, which I'll discuss, and he died at the Kibbutz Tel Chai in 1920 when they were attacked by Arabs. And his dying words, "It is good to have a country to die for," are probably known by all school children in Israel. So the first incarnation of a Jewish army was the Zion Mule Corps. It was primarily made of Jewish men expelled by the Turks and exiled in Egypt, and they were eager to volunteer to fight the Turks. But the British would not allow foreign nationals to be in a combat unit. And in other words, they would not be able to have arms, but they would allow a supply battalion. So they performed it with honor at Gallipoli. The campaign, however, was an utter disaster, which was blamed on the First Lord of the Admiralty, who was Winston Churchill. Following Gallipoli, the Zion Mule Corps was disbanded, although Trumpeldor and Colonel Patterson did not want that to happen, but they did it nonetheless. But going back, Zev Jabotinsky, we'll talk about in more detail, but especially Lord Herbert Kitchener, who was the commander-in-chief of the British Armed Forces in the war. He was a vehement anti-Semite and did not want a Jewish army or Jewish legion or anything related to a select Jewish military force to be in existence under any circumstances. So the war in the Middle East was three fronts. The Turks tried to seize the Suez Canal twice, but were repelled. The Dardanelles was Gallipoli, and that was a major disaster. The British tried to basically blockade and take over Constantinople and basically knock Turkey out of the war early, but they weren't able to do so. The loss of lives, especially amongst Australian and New Zealand troops, was significant. In Mesopotamia, the British first assault, they lost the siege of Kut. Over 10,000 British troops, mostly British and Indian troops, were starved out, and it was a humiliating defeat. The Turks still celebrate this to this day. But the next 3 years was a slog from Basra to Baghdad to Mosul. Sounds kind of familiar with our war in Iraq, because those names are all very familiar to us. And in early 1917, the British had gotten no further than Gaza and had not been able to get past it despite a newly built railroad across the Sinai. So what happened at this point? Well, my grandfather worked in a new endeavor in the war effort. There were lots of war-related jobs in abundance, and the pay was steady. Maybe not high, but it was steady. He worked for the Canadian National Railway, was crating and shipping munitions. The armaments moved by rail from Montreal to Halifax. There they were placed on convoys and then to Europe. And Halifax was the major port on the Atlantic for Canada, and also for the Allied forces. Halifax was the major assembly point for the convoys and trying to evade U-boats. Then, as an aside here, on the 17th of December 1917, two ships collided with each other in the Narrows in Halifax Harbor. The Mont Blanc, which was full of high explosives and aviation fuel, which was in barrels on the deck of the boat, collided with the cargo ship in the Narrows and created the single most powerful pre-atomic age man-made explosion in history. If you remember what the explosion looked like in Beirut back in August of 2020, up that by another 50%, and that's what it was. So at least 2,000 dead, 9,000 injured. But the Canadians were up to it, and it only stopped the convoys for 1 week. The aid that came to Halifax, as an aside, mostly the first people to reach the people there, because after the explosion, a blizzard hit later that day, so people were unable to get out of buildings that had collapsed, came from Boston by train. And ever since that time, the Christmas tree that is put in Boston and the Commons comes from Halifax every year. They've been sister cities since 1917. So in June of 1916 came the miracle. Lord Kitchener died. He was, needless to say, the most vehement of the anti-Semites in the British military. And as the Supreme Commander, he was taking part in a secret diplomatic mission by cruiser from Scotland to Russia to meet with the Russians, who weren't doing very well in the war at that point. And the cruiser was caught in a storm, sunk, and he drowned. Now things change. So interestingly, the birth of the Jewish Legion didn't actually start with the British. Ben Gurion and Ben Zvi proposed to the Turks a Jewish battalion at the beginning of the war, hoping that it would find favor. But the Supreme Commander of the Turks was a Zionist hater, and he said absolutely not. Jews were in prison and then they were exiled, so that was the end of that idea. There was other opposition to the Jewish Legion. Let me just come back to here. But let's talk about Zeb Jabotinsky, who really was the father of this. He wrote a book called The History of the Jewish Legion, which only printed one edition back in 1940, the year before he died. He was a journalist, poet, author. He almost made it through law school. He didn't finish it in Italy. He was at the University of Rome, and it was during his what he calls Bohemian days, and he just didn't care. He pushed for a Jewish army aligned with the British, and he joined with Trumpeldor in Alexandria to try to push the idea. And he started proposing this in 1914 to liberate Palestine. Trumpeldor was willing to accept, let's just get this Zion Mule Corps started. And in the meantime, Jabotinsky continued to push the War Office, got a cold shoulder until Kitchener died. But he also had to deal with the attitudes of Jews in Britain. So you had two major oppositions to this in the UK. what I call the tailors of Whitechapel. This was the immigrant community, mostly Jews who had settled from Eastern Europe and the Pale. They did not want to fight on the side of Russia. It was unthinkable. And they had no military obligation as they were not citizens. But they were foreigners earning a living in the UK. And while British soldiers were dying en masse on the Western Front, the public felt that they were not contributing. In fact, they were contributing nothing to national defense, certainly something that could lead to a significant anti-Semitism. The other opposition were the largely assimilationist Jewish community already in the UK. They didn't support the Zionist cause. Most opposed the leadership, and the leading opponents were Lord Rothschild and Lord Montagu. Chaim Weizmann was the notable exception. He was a chemist who developed the mass production of acetone, which was a vital component in the production of cordite, which was a smokeless explosive, which was vital to the Allied war effort. So suddenly everything changes. Kitchener dies in June of 1916, and then the Russian Revolution of March 1917. This is the forgotten revolution. Everybody knows about the October Revolution, but people forget about the March Revolution, which ousted the Tsar. And the causes for the revolution are noted here. The peasants were poor. Revolutionaries wanted things changed. The Russia was doing horrible in the war, and Rasputin's role with the royal family just didn't do very well. So at this point, the Tsar was out, the Duma was in, and anti-Jewish laws were abolished in Russia. And soon after that, Russia made a separate peace with the Germans. So the opposition crumbles. Whitechapel Jews no longer oppose with Russia out of the war. The War Office changed its opinion. And in July of 1917, Colonel Patterson was ordered to organize, and Jabotinsky was in charge of recruitment. The anti-Zionist British Jewish establishment would not allow the term Jewish Legion. So it had to be the Royal Fusiliers, and foreign recruitment began. And these were the 3 battalions. Hebrew, the term battalion is Gedud. So there was the 38th Royal Fusiliers, which were made up of British Jews, the 39th Royal Fusiliers, which was made up of predominantly American volunteers and some Canadian volunteers, and the 40th, which was made up of the exiled Palestinian Jews. So back in Montreal, recruitment begins. And these are what the recruitment posters were in English and in Yiddish. Except with the Yiddish one, you know that the first name of Captain Friedman was Isidore. You can read that from the Yiddish. But you can see that they were enthusiastic to do this. The office for recruitment was on St. Lawrence Boulevard, and my grandfather was very happy to leave his neighborhood. This is actually the street that he lived on. This is Cadieux Street in Plateau, Montreal. This is a picture taken in 1915. And this is his recruitment. It's a copy of his recruitment paper with his address. And says he was a plumber. I guess he felt that was a vital occupation, although he was actually shipping munitions for the Canadian National Railroad. But the interesting thing is here, he's put his birth date down here is 1900. Now, mind you, he was 6'2", and he was born on July 15th, 1902. He signed for the military at the end of May of 1918. He wasn't even 16. He was 15. May 24th is an important date for him, but also Canadian history. It was the day that women in Canada got the right to vote. But it was also a Friday, and since his parents were strictly Orthodox, he knew that if he got shipped by train on May 24th, that by the time Shabbat was over, he'd already be at the training camp, and they'd have no way of getting him back. So that is what he did. And he went to Fort Edward, which was in Windsor, Nova Scotia, also famous for the birthplace of hockey. Amongst those who were trained at Fort Edward were David Ben-Gurion, who was also in the 39th Royal Fusiliers. This is a picture of what it looked like. They all lived in tents and got their initial training here. This is a picture Yom Kippur in 1918. Ben-Gurion was a politician and a soldier. My grandfather did not have a high opinion of Ben-Gurion. He said he was more a politician than a soldier, And to quote my grandfather, he never did a good day of soldiering in his life. So that was my grandfather's opinion of David Ben-Gurion. This is a picture of him at Fort Edward. And through the historian at the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society, we know this is the only known photograph of an individual soldier at Fort Edward that was ever taken. Everything else was a group picture. This is the only one that we know. The building in the back is the officers' quarters, which burned down in 1921. From here, he was sent by convoy out of Halifax. They came under U-boat attack. Guns were blazing on the boats, and he was left with a permanent hearing loss, which was never corrected. He went from there to England, had training, and then shipped by train through France, then by ship from Italy to Alexandria, and then to Tel El Kebir, which was the British base by the Suez Canal. It's between Cairo and the Suez Canal. And uniforms changed, and here he is in his uniform. He was already 16 by this point. His birthday would have already come, which was July 15th. So here he is. Oh, notice the cigarette too, makes him look much, much older. But this did not fool anybody. The first muster at Tel El Kebir, he had to deal with this gentleman, their commander, Colonel Eliezer Margolin. Margolin had immigrated to Russia in the second Aliyah with his parents in 1892. By 1902, both his parents had died, each within a week of each other. And he basically had to take over farming, and he just didn't find he was very good at it. So he moved to Cully in Western Australia and became involved in the Australian military, which is how he worked his way up to colonel. And at this first muster, all the men are lined up, and Colonel Margolin is walking by with the sergeant major, and he looks at my grandfather straight in the eye, looks to the sergeant major and says, "Put the kid in the kitchen." So he didn't fool Margolin one bit. So the British drive into Palestine ended up unstalling in the autumn of 1917. They got past Gaza and liberated Jerusalem in December of 1917. The Jewish Legion, they arrived fairly late. It was into 1918 when they arrived. And their role in the war was fighting in the Jordan Valley and at Megiddo. And that was where they saw combat during the war, but it was towards the very end. Things were sort of late, but while there, my grandfather was stationed at Lydda, or Lod, or actually basically where the airport is now for Tel Aviv. And that was where he was stationed. It was mostly an Arab city. This was what Tel Aviv looked like to him. It was very small. Except for the areas around the docks, the residential area was basically 4 blocks. And I believe this is Mayor Dizengoff's house over here, which eventually became Independence Hall years later, when Israel was established. So this was what Tel Aviv looked like at the time that he was there. There was not much to it. This is Rothschild Boulevard, by the way. No trees, no sidewalks. Very small. Rishon LeZion was very nearby to Lydda, and Carmel Wine Factory was there. And they left the wine cellars open to the Jewish troops 24/7. They could go in any time when they wanted and take as much wine as they wanted. It was quite a perk. And one thing that my grandfather noted that with regards to Arab and Jew, what united them at that point in time was poverty. They were all poor. They were all struggling. But one of the things, remember, the children always saying was, "Tov aleinu be'artzenu." It's good unto us to be within our own land. And so it was. They did what they did, and they did their best. Towards the end of the war, he did MP duty at Tel El Kebir, basically guarding Turkish and Austrian prisoners of war. Now, some of those Austrian soldiers were Jewish, and what they would do at night was they would sneak supplies to the Austrian Jewish soldiers who were in the POW camp, because they could at least speak Yiddish to each other, and they would smuggle things in, but they had to do it very stealthily, because the Austrian troops who were prisoners did not want the Gentile Austrian troops to know that they were getting supplies more than they were getting. So he is in this picture here over here on the left. So that was during his period when he was military police. Before that, while they were in Israel, part of his battalion mutinied against the British. They did not like the officers. They were not Jewish. They did not like how they were being treated, and they actually mutinied. My grandfather was arrested along with all of them. Strangely, though, he was out getting supplies with the cook when this all happened, and Jabotinsky walked in to serve as their lawyer. Although he didn't have a law degree, he came close, but he never did. And several of his colleagues, my grandfather's colleagues, ended up in a hard labor camp for mutiny, but he was absolved because he had no part in it. While he was in Jerusalem, he obtained this bronze plate, which says on the top of it, Medinat Yisrael. And this is one of the few things that he was able to bring back from Palestine. Although he was 17 at the end of the war, he wanted to stay in Palestine, but he was underage, because age of majority then was 21, and they wouldn't let him stay, although he desperately wanted to. But this was one of the few things that was not stolen on the way back, because a lot of his things were stolen when they got to Marseille on his way back. This hung in my grandparents' kitchen for 60 years, and hung on the front of in our house when you walked in the front door for about 30 years, until I moved it now down here to my study. The other thing here is, this is a sterling silver Magen David that was produced at the Bezalel School in honor of the Jewish Legion in Jerusalem, which my grandfather got when he visited Jerusalem. You can tell it's Bezalel because the name is in here. It's stamped in the bottom. We inquired of this of an expert in artwork done by early Bezalel artists. At the time that my grandfather got this, Bezalel School was only in a second floor over a storefront in Jerusalem. I mean, now it's one of the major art institutions, the major art institution in Israel. What the expert told us, that this is probably the only one in existence. Because he said if there was more, he said the Israel Museum would have gotten their hands on it long ago. But this has been passed on in the family. My mother wears it to this day. Now, with the end of the war, needless to say, before the end of the war, the British and the French were into their imperialist ways, and they were already dividing up the Middle East before the war was over. So in 1916, they already had it divided up, was who's going to be in charge of Iraq, and who's going to be in charge of Palestine, and who's going to be in charge of Syria. So the French and Lebanon, so the French would have their share and the British would have their share. So they were already scheming like they usually did. And the original Palestine mandate was broken up in 1922 into what most of us remember as Palestine, but also Jordan. That was actually part of the original Palestine mandate when this was given to the Hashemites. After the war, my grandfather married into a family of also Zionists. Isaac Young, my great-grandfather, was an early ardent Poil Zionist, a labor Zionist. And this is a share. This is a share that I framed of a Jewish Colonial Trust. This was a forerunner of the JNF. He bought this in 1913. This was a labor of love to put this together. The parts that made this up were found in 3 different places, and I was able to piece it together. It took a couple of years to do that, but just had to remember where everything was. After the war, my grandfather's family moved from Montreal to Worcester, Massachusetts. There was a significant recession in Montreal after the war. The war-related jobs, they all dried up, and work was scarce, and so they moved to Worcester, Massachusetts. And in April of 1921, Worcester was visited by Chaim Weizmann, and And at the same time, also, the family changed their name from Petrovsky to Page. They Americanized it. So there's my grandfather right here behind Weizmann. Apparently, let's go back to this. This same day that this occurred, Weizmann was touring the country with Albert Einstein. It was on this particular day that Einstein met with Louis Brandeis. And Einstein came to the conclusion that Brandeis was too assimilationist a Jew to be an effective Zionist leader. And he was opposed to, because he was opposed to political Zionism. Now, ironically, a Jewish university in the United States was established after World War II, which was to be called Einstein University. Einstein turned it down because of his close and abiding devotion to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So the school was subsequently named Brandeis University instead of Einstein University. The Fort Edward is now a historic site in Canada. This is the informational poster that they have at Fort Edward. And in it, and on this is a picture of David Ben-Gurion with a letter that he wrote to his family about it, and the picture of my grandfather. So that's about as close as I think they would ever get. In 1977, Israel awarded the IDF awarded my grandfather the Defender's Medal of Israel, which he received at a ceremony at the Israeli consulate in Boston with the whole family present. And it was quite a day for us. This is my grandfather in his mid-80s, as I remember him so fondly. But I always like to think of him as he was when he was a young soldier and was an activist in the early steps that eventually resulted in the creation of the State of Israel. And that's it, folks.
Thank you, Robert.
Fascinating.
That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Are there questions?
Can you make a gallery view?
Okay. I was surprised when you mentioned that Austria was the first country to liberate the Jews. I had no idea.
No, that's a little known fact. They actually did it about 1787. Now, it wasn't to the extent that the French did. I mean, the French, it was a true liberation. It was somewhat limited. It was only limited to certain parts of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
Oh, okay.
So I guess it was a strategic liberation.
Did your grandfather have any contact with Jabotinsky after the war?
No, as far as we know, he did not have any contact with Jabotinsky after the war. Anyone else?
Interesting.
Yeah. Robert, could you say something more about, I never heard that Brandeis University was to be Einstein University.
Yes, it was to be Einstein University. He flat out refused.
And,
Just like he flat out refused to be the first president of Israel.
right. Why did he refuse to be?
He affiliated himself with the founding and the beginnings of Hebrew University. And so his loyalty was to Hebrew University. He was not going to have loyalty split.
Okay.
So his parents must have been frantic all the time he was over there.
I don't think my great grandmother ever forgave him. I mean, basically what he did was he took his last paycheck, put it under the pillow so that she would find it on Erev Shabbat, and he was gone.
No
The
note?
Wow.
He didn't leave a note? He didn't leave any?
Oh, he left a note, but essentially, we used to always say that when he went back to Montreal, they had already moved to the United States, so they weren't there for him. But no, that's not really true. They all moved around the same time when he got back. But the thing is that he was already a veteran at 17.
Mm-hmm.
Did he write any, was he able to write letters to them from Palestine or from the front anywhere?
Not that we have. Remember, a lot of stuff was lost over time. I still have the regimental badges, though. That I still have. That he had on the uniform or on the on his cap that stated it's the Royal Fusiliers, with basically an eternal light behind it, flame behind it, which distinguished them. But that's about it with respect to stuff. I mean, so much stuff he had that he wanted to bring home, he wasn't able to.
But do you know whether or not he was able to communicate with his mother, or she just had his?
I am sure he did. I'm sure he did during the war. Yes, because a lot of the stuff that these pictures were taken from are postcards.
Mhm.
So I'm sure that there were those that he kept for himself and those that he used and he sent to his family. So I strongly doubt that they were incommunicado.
Why did the British Jewish organization, why did they not want it to be a Jewish legion?
They thought, well, amongst assimilationist Jews in Britain, they thought it would shine too much of a light on them.
Uh-huh.
They just didn't want it to be prominently quote unquote Jewish.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions?
All right. Well,
Well,
this has been a pleasure.
Oh,
Thank
this
you,
is really good, Bob.
It's
Thank
our
you so much.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Fascinating, Robert.
Yeah,
Really, really
great.
amazing.
Great job.
Thank you. All right, let's see.
and your mother's on?
What's that?
Is your mother on this?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
I strongly doubt it. All right.
Bye, Robert.
All right, Joel. Bye, guys.
Feedback.
Good to see everybody.
So coming up.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
Hi,
Thank
Sandy.
you.
Hi, Bob. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. Thank
You're
you.
welcome, Misha. Good to
Nice
see you.
job, Robert.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Good night. That's this messy table. Okay. All right. I'm going to end this.
Yeah.
And